introduce to you a man who I communicated with quite a bit on the phone and learned all about his work in Missoula. Actually, Dan, my father, 5 years ago, when I mentioned that you were going to speak here, he was very, very excited because he took Dan's book on ecology and politics and distributed it to commission it all through our community and down in Texas and a bunch of different areas that he thought would be very effective to work with Dan as an author. So I've only heard of you through my father, and I could just read off of this immense bio here. You've done so many things, and I'm looking very forward to hearing you speak. And so I'm just going to keep it brief, we're going to get to it. Could everyone please welcome Dan Kemmis from Missoula.
Considerably too small for this room, and this podium is considerably too high for the kind of discussion that I'm hoping that we might have. So at the very least, just so that I can see you, I'm going to ask if people can move down forward a little bit. Yep. Thank you for moving up. I appreciate that. That'll help. What I'm hoping that we can do this afternoon is have some discussion. I really haven't come here with any pretense of bringing answers or solutions, but I do think that within this general arena that we face some challenges about how to bring the good work that people have been here to discuss for the last couple of days, how to bring it into our political life more effectively. So it's that dimension of this work that I'd like to visit with you about, and I'm going to talk for a little while and then just encourage you to jump in with your own ideas and thoughts and discussion about this. So I'm going to begin by giving you a little bit of an autobiographical sketch here, not because I in any sense think that my story is of any particular importance, but it's a way of kind of illustrating some of what I think has been going on in this arena for the last several years. So please indulge me while I do that, and what I really invite you to do is to think about how your life stories intersect with the larger story that I'm going to be alluding to here. So, I was born in eastern Montana, way east. I was actually born in Fairview, which is as far east as you can get without falling into North Dakota. I grew up on a farm near Ritchie, Montana, and went to high school in Sydney. So my background is agricultural, small town, a very poor family. We finally had to move off of the farm because it was just too small and too dry to support our family. Still, I had a very good life, and among other things, I grew up being fascinated with politics, partly because I had a great uncle who had served in the Montana legislature and was sort of held up as a family hero to me. Mike Mansfield was at that time the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, and I was always very proud of Mansfield and fascinated by how he had gotten there. And so I kind of made up my mind early on that politics was what I loved best, and in a sense I've stuck with that, although I've done a number of other things. Eventually, after going east to go to college and staying in New England for about 8 years after high school, I came back to Montana, this time to the western end of the state, to Missoula. I went there to study philosophy and did that for about 1.5 years, and then got bit by the political bug once again and ran for the legislature, got elected and served for a decade in the Montana legislature, including a term as minority leader and a term as speaker. So I got an opportunity to engage in the activity that I had grown up thinking that I had wanted to do. And indeed, it was a fascinating experience, and in many, many ways a very satisfying experience. Those of you who are not politicians by nature probably have a little bit of trouble understanding how anybody can love politics as much as some of us in fact do. But it really is a fascinating calling, and I've always thought an honorable and important component of how we as human beings figure out how to live well in the places that we inhabit. Well, I found a lot of satisfaction in being in the legislature and in doing politics there. I also began to feel that there were some aspects of it being there that were pretty deeply dissatisfying to me. Not dissatisfying in the way that it sometimes is for people, that it's going to drive them away from doing it or sours them on the whole enterprise. It wasn't that for me, so much as just a sense that there must be a better way than some of what we were doing. And what I was noticing in particular was that, especially when I got into leadership, it became really clear to me that my job when I was a minority leader was to make my party look good and make the other party look bad. That's essentially what I did every day. Now that's an overstatement to a certain extent, but if you watch how the legislature operates, I think you can get some sense that that's a lot of what goes on in Helena. To a certain extent, that was okay with me. I mean, I sort of understood that as part of the game, but there was something that was not okay, and that was that I knew perfectly well that there were people on the other side of the aisle who were good thinkers, who were deeply committed to Montana, who had a great deal to offer in terms of trying to figure out how to take on the challenges that this place presents to us. What I found dissatisfying was that in the political culture that we had built up and that I and my colleagues had inherited, that there was practically no opportunity at all for those of us on different sides of the aisle or different ideological perspectives to ever sit down together and have an intellectually honest conversation where our different ideas could come together, inform one another, where our different ways of caring about Montana and about people in Montana could come together in fruitful discussion. That's just not how the system works. And what I became more and more concerned about was that the way the system did work seemed to me to have a number of bad consequences. On the one hand, I realized that, well, there are some of us who are political junkies who can just love doing that kind of thing no matter what. That for most people, watching that go on day after day is not very satisfying, and in fact is very alienating, so that you could almost feel people shrinking away from politics, and you could see the voter turnout literally shrinking as people got more and more tired of that way of doing things. The other thing that was a concern to me was that, while my politics were quite liberal, progressive, we would now say green, I was a strong environmentalist, I was part of at that time, in the 70s, a majority in the state legislature who were in favor of and were enacting strong environmental protection laws for Montana and so on. Well, it was satisfying to be part of that kind of majority on behalf of principles that I believed in. I also had a sense that the way that we did politics meant that as soon as the other side could figure out how to get in the majority, that the principles and policies that my colleagues and I had fought for would be immediately in danger. And there was something about that swing of the pendulum from one end to the other that, while in one way I understand that a certain amount of that is inevitable, still it seemed to me that it kind of went hand in hand with the earlier phenomenon that I had mentioned. And that is that it was in part because we were so polarized, because there was no real possibility of talking to each other fruitfully. It was because of that that the pendulum could only swing. It could only be at one end or the other. It was very hard to find a constructive middle place for it to rest even for a moment. Well, out of those particular frustrations, and then out of the fact that I had done that for a while, that I had a young family and I needed to think of other ways of supporting them and so on, I eventually left the legislature, but as I did that, I began to try to work out in my mind certain questions. One was, why is our politics the way that it is? And the second was, what are the alternatives that we might come up with to that? And out of that thinking, eventually I started writing. I wrote a book that was published in 1990, Community and the Politics of Place, in which I tried to examine historically the roots of the very adversarial politics that had grown up, not only in places like the legislature, but increasingly in public hearing rooms all across the state and indeed across the country. And so I tried to take a look at that extremely adversarial way of making public decisions. And then I started asking, well, is there any possible alternative? And if so, what could the alternative be? What I was drawn to as a place to look for some kind of an alternative was what I had observed in the Montana legislature. And that is that in spite of all of their differences, that I was quite convinced that most of the people in that legislature cared deeply about their own communities here in Montana, cared deeply, in fact, about Montana as a whole, cared deeply about the people who called this place home. And so what I began to ask about is there any possibility of using that attachment to place, that sense of place, that way of identifying who we are by where we are, is there any possibility that that might provide the basis for a different way of doing business? Now at this point, I want to make it really clear that this is in no sense in any important way a story about me. It turns out, wrote a book about that where I tried to develop this theme of community and what I call the politics of place as a possible way in which people could transcend those differences that seem to get in the way of our making sound decisions, making lasting decisions, making sustainable decisions. But the book that I wrote turned out to be just one of quite a number of reflections that began to emerge from the landscape, almost literally, especially across the West. And what started to happen throughout the 1990s with increasing frequency and intensity is that both in theory and in practice, people began to develop this idea of somehow getting people to transcend their differences, sit down together face to face, and solve problems together. And as I say, it was a development both in theory and in practice. Some very good writing began to emerge about that, especially across the West, but not here alone. And at the same time, a rather remarkable amount of practice began to arise. Where we saw it most especially, but not exclusively, was in the arena of public lands, where people for decades had been essentially fighting each other to a standstill in public hearing rooms. You began to see, while that fighting continued to go on, you began to see alongside of it, a lot of those warriors begin to sort of go into side rooms where environmentalists, local environmentalists and loggers or fishermen and farmers would sit down together and in effect say, isn't there some way that we could keep enough water in this stream to take care of the fish and at the same time take enough water out of the stream in a conservative way to keep agriculture viable in this valley? Or isn't there some way that we could protect habitat for endangered species in this forest and at the same time continue to take enough logs in a sustainable way to keep some of these sawmills open and keep these communities going? That's sort of a shorthand way of describing what eventually emerged and began to be referred to as the collaboration movement, which again was taking place all across the country but seemed to be occurring with particular intensity here in the West. Going back to my own story then, to kind of flesh this out, a couple of things happened with me. One is that having left the legislature, having taken a little bit of time to try to think all of this through, to write about the idea of community and community politics, it kind of made sense for me to try my hand at community politics. If community was where it seemed to me that the real hope lay, then I felt that I wanted to give that a try in practice. And so I ended up running for mayor of Missoula and serving in that capacity through the early 90s. And there I was able to experience what it's like to work not sort of in the abstract policy-making setting of the state legislature, but in a place where what you're dealing with is everyday life and trying to make a community work well. And once again, I found that extremely satisfying, extremely challenging. There was never a day that there wasn't a new challenge brought to the mayor's office. Some of them we dealt with well, some of them I wish we had dealt with better. But overall, my sense that community is in a sense where it's at in terms of democratic politics was strongly reinforced by that. But not only that, the sense that the way that people care about the places that they love, that is the real basis for an effective politics was reinforced as well. So I had that experience for several years at City Hall, and while that was happening sort of out of the corner of my eye, I was watching what was happening across the West. I was watching the development of this collaboration movement. At the same time, I was watching a sort of sharpening of the divisions across the West. Those things seem contradictory, and to a certain extent they probably are, but two historical movements moving maybe at right angles to each other. I personally became more and more interested in the West itself and eventually moved from the mayor's office to the Center for the Rocky Mountain West at the University of Montana, where I've been for the last 7 years. And there, along with colleagues like Bill Farr and Larry Swanson and former Congressman Pat Williams, we did spend every day looking at Western issues and trying to figure out how the West as a region can do a better job of dealing with the issues that we face. And now against that background, I just want to suggest a few things about what I see happening on the political front, particularly as it relates to the kinds of topics that you all have been discussing and listening about over the last couple of days. So let me just make a few observations about that. First, a historical observation. Over a century ago, the West was observed closely by someone who became a kind of prophet for the West, John Wesley Powell, whom many of you have heard of. Powell was the first white explorer of the Colorado River. He went on to become the head of the U.S. Geological Survey, where in effect he became America's chief map maker. His job and his agency's job, in a sense, was to map the whole country, but since it was the interior West that was largely unmapped at that time, it was here that Powell devoted his attention. But his attention was not only on mapping, it was on the question that we would now put in terms of if people of European descent are going to inhabit this arid country, how can they do it sustainably? The answer that Powell came up with to that question was, in the arid West, you cannot possibly hope to live well and sustainably unless you pay attention to the landscape itself and form your political institutions and jurisdictions according to the lay of the land. In particular, what he argued was that if we were going to inhabit this landscape well, that we needed to do it according to the way the water flowed. He argued that watersheds should be the main political jurisdiction. And he argued fiercely against laying down straight lines on Western landscapes. He said, don't draw straight lines on the West. Well, all we have to do is look at a map of the West and look at all those square-cornered states to know that we essentially paid no attention to Powell at all. But the other thing that he said, which puzzled people and puzzled them for a very long time, was this. He said that if you divide yourself up according to the lay of the land, according to the way the water flows, that it will heighten considerably your capacity to cooperate with each other. If you draw straight lines and try to inhabit the landscape in ways that the landscape in fact doesn't understand, you won't understand where you are, and you will end up having more battles with each other than you in any sense need. Whereas if you will pay attention to watersheds, it will encourage cooperation within those watersheds. Nobody could figure out what in the world he was talking about. It was just a total mystery to people. Look, land is land. You know, we're here to take advantage of the wealth of this place. Let's get on with it. And so all of Powell's recommendations were essentially ignored. What many of us began to notice in the 1990s was that after over 100 years of ignoring Powell, that in some sense the West was beginning to redeem his vision. We saw two things begin to happen simultaneously, and they almost always went hand in hand. One was that people did indeed begin to pay attention to watersheds again. You saw the formation of watershed councils all across the West, where people within those watersheds, people engaged in different kinds of economic activities, farming, ranching, timber production, recreation, living in cities. People within watersheds began to recognize that indeed it's within the watershed that they have the most in common. And the other thing that began to happen simultaneously was this collaboration movement, where people did indeed begin to cooperate with each other in the way that Powell had argued they were going to have to if we were going to inhabit the West very well. Well, what we want to make of that story, I think all of us can draw our own conclusions from it. What's interesting to me is that, of course, like any good story, it hasn't ended yet, and we don't know where it's going to go. There are some real challenges to collaboration afoot on the landscape now. Exactly how we're going to make it really a part of the way that we do business is a very big question. But having laid out sort of that historical background, let me just talk now about two contemporary phenomena. And some of this I expect will be provocative. I kind of hope it will, because it'll be a place for us to begin our discussion. One has to do with sort of the politics of preservation or of environmental protection. And here I think that there are some fundamental choices now facing us. On the one hand, there's the environmental movement itself has tended to favor strong national solutions and national policies, which very often in the West are met with resistance and suspicion. Some of those environmental positions have now become, from my perspective, very problematic in the West, and problematic for our continuing to develop this kind of strain of cooperation. What I'm talking of in particular are movements like zero cut, or what's sometimes called end commercial logging, led by a number of environmental organizations. The thrust of it is to try to get all commercial logging off of the national forests. Now, in terms of environmental motivation and so on, it's very easy to understand where that comes from. There's a case that can be made for it, and if there's anyone here who wants to make that case, it would be very welcome. The point I want to make is that increasingly, within Western communities, that kind of position is turning people against environmentalism itself. And that, I think, is a shame, because many of the people, I believe, who become strongly anti-environmental are not fundamentally anti-environmental. And here I think that the environmental movement needs to re-examine the question of the relationship between environmentalism on the one hand and community on the other. When environmentalism comes to seem like a serious threat to communities and to whole ways of life, then I think it has gotten itself in a position that is very problematic. The same thing happens with the cattle-free movement, the effort to get all cattle off of the public lands. Again, there's an environmental argument to be made for it, but the resistance that it generates to environmentalism itself is a very high price to pay. And the sense that here again, there's kind of an attack, a wholesale attack on a whole way of life is very problematic. Okay, so there's that phenomenon, there's that kind of dynamic going on, and it goes on here in Montana. It goes on in Missoula. We see environmentalists sort of on both sides of that. It goes on in Bozeman, it goes on across the state. The other dynamic that I want to mention, and then bring my remarks to a close, has to do with the relationship between the way we do things in Montana at the community level and the way we do them at the state level. And here I just want to start by asking you to do a little thought exercise. I want to ask each of you to just quickly think 3 things that you're very proud of that your community has done in the last 10 years. Just imagine that you've got an out-of-state visitor and you want to brag up your community a little bit. What are the 3 things that you would be most proud of? Now, my guess is that if any of you have any difficulty with that, it's probably the difficulty of sorting through and just bringing it down to 3 things. Now I want you to think of the 3 things that you're proudest of that Montana has done over the last 10 years. And I don't know how you're doing, but my experience generally is that people have a lot harder time quite figuring that out than they do with their community. To the extent that that's true, I just want to suggest something here. And first of all, I want to do just a little bit more history. Most of you here are familiar with, or at least have heard of, K. Ross Toole, the Montana historian who wrote some great books about Montana, one of which was called Montana, an Uncommon Land. When Professor Toole was writing his books back in the 60s and 70s, I think many Montanans really had a strong sense of pride in Montana. That pride was reflected in the Constitution that we adopted in 1972, where the language that we used in the preamble and so on spoke of the very strong pride that people had in being Montanans. Now, I don't want to suggest that we have stopped feeling that, but I do want to suggest that our political system is making it harder and harder for us to really be proud of ourselves as Montanans. When we think about how a legislative session goes and the way we feel at the end of a legislative session, pride would probably not be the first word that would come to mind. And I think that this is a problem. I think it's both a problem and an opportunity. Because what I want to argue is that within our communities, where people have not just kind of an abstract sense of place, but a strongly lived sense of place, that our capacity to do good work together, to make things work within that community, is still pretty vibrant, still pretty vital. We're still capable of doing that to a remarkable extent here in Montana. But to a substantial extent, I think that capacity for good citizenship, which is what I think it's all about, does not carry over from the community to the state level. We don't have the same capacity at the state level to figure out what it is, what our possibilities are, what our challenges are, and to sit down and work out creative solutions to those challenges and possibilities in the way that we very often do at a community level. I don't want to overstate that on either side. We do some good work at the state level, we have lots of failures at the community level, but I think there's enough of a difference there that we need to start asking ourselves whether it isn't time for at least some of us who have quite a bit of experience and a little bit of savvy, or just a whole lot of commitment for making our communities work, whether we don't need to start challenging ourselves to bring some of that same energy, that same creativity, that same problem-solving capacity to the state level. Our center, the Center for the Rocky Mountain West, is just beginning to explore the possibility of working with leaders in communities across Montana to see if we couldn't, by sitting down together, talking about our community's agenda and then having communities compare notes, whether we might not be able to come up with a statewide community agenda for Montana that civic leaders across the state could work on. If something like that can work, it will be, I believe, because of the general maturing, is what I want to call it, that we've been going through over the last few decades that I have described. The poet Gary Snyder and other bioregionalists talk about re-inhabiting a landscape. And what they mean by that is that people can live in a particular landscape for quite a long time, and in a sense not really know where they are. They can live there thinking that the place is limitless, that they can do anything that they want with it. They can live there thinking that it doesn't matter very much how you organize yourselves, that you can either cooperate or not, it doesn't matter very much. You can draw the lines however you want, it doesn't matter very much. But over time, as you live in a place long enough, the place begins to sort of plow its wisdom back into the people who live there, or at least that possibility exists. And it's generally, I think, through living together and through trying hard to live well together that we learn those lessons that the landscape has been trying to teach us. I think we are learning those lessons. I think we need to keep learning them. And I think that that's where the politics of bioregionalism, the politics of sustainability really begins to take root. So while some of what I've said has a little bit of a pessimistic ring to it, I want to leave you with my own sense that deep down we're getting better at this. And I think that this conference is an example of people who are committed to getting better at this. So I want to thank you for that commitment and thank you for your attention. Thanks very much.
We live in Clancy, Montana. And I just had a question for you. I'm really interested in your remarks. I think you've made some really important points here. I have a question. We've lived here, my husband and I moved here 28 years ago. And of course, so we're relatively new Montanans. And I'm just wondering if you could address some of the tension that we've met working in environmental areas has come a lot from what you hear as I'm a native Montanan or I'm a fifth generation Montanan versus it seems every time, not every time, very often, what happens is we go from you care about the environment or landscape or whatever, well, you're just a newcomer. That kind of a tension. And I guess it's not a particular thing, but I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Let me strongly encourage other people to respond to any of the questions or comments that you hear here, because at this point, you all know as much as I do. So I'd be very interested to hear how anybody else would respond to this. I think that there's a natural tendency for people in any area to be a little bit parochial, to feel like you have to have lived there for a certain amount of time in order to have any real claim to being a genuine part of the community. So in one sense, I think we probably never get away from that. On the other hand, I mean, to me, this is a fairly complex picture, and so I'll just talk about what I see as some of the dimensions of it. One thing, of course, is that people who have lived in a place for a very long time can get stuck in their ways and can benefit greatly from having new people come to that place. I mean, I'll just say, I think that part of what I found so stimulating about doing local politics in Missoula is that new people are always coming to Missoula by the nature of having a university there. That's the way that it is. But throughout the Rocky Mountain West, we've had all of this in-migration for the last 15 years now. And a lot of that, I think, has been very healthy. It's meant that people have come here with understandings of other ways of doing things that we in Montana can benefit from greatly. The other side of that, I think, is that people can come to a place and not really know where they are. I mean, and one of the things I think we've seen and that we struggle with is that people come to a place because it has a strong sense of community, because it works well in a lot of ways, but it's very easy for people to come there, and I know you're not these people, but it can happen, that people come there and kind of take it for granted. They say, hey, what a great community, this is just what we wanted, and then just sit back and take from it without giving back to it. And I think it's tremendously important for Montanans and other Westerners to welcome people and say, yeah, you're right, this is a great community, and it is because of all the people who have made it a great community, and we're really eager to have you contribute in that way too. So that's nothing decisive or conclusive, but those are some of the elements of newness and oldness that I think we deal with. Clyde?
A couple of points. First of all, I appreciate your remarks. I thought they were very astute, and I thank you for them. Question number one is how the people of this state, most of whom I think are not only angry but disgusted with the partisan nature of the state legislature, get the message to our legislators that we're tired of all this partisan rancor that starts weeks before the session. And how do we get these people to start looking at solving problems? I've testified in the legislature both in an official capacity as a member of the Board of Medical Examiners and also as a private citizen, and the tension in those chambers is palpable. Secondly, I'd just like to make an observation in response to your remark about some of the extreme environmental positions. I agree with you, some of them are extreme to the point of being absurd. But I think one of the reasons that happened is that there's been so much, it's a reactionary kind of thing to some of the terrible abuses that many of those who care about the world that's other than human have seen go on, and particularly in public lands.
Let me respond to that second point first. I agree with that. I mean, there have been some terrible abuses in the landscapes, and particularly on the public lands. The amount of clear cutting, the amount of overgrazing, some of the mining abuses, and so on are just egregious, and none of those should be repeated. Just speaking for a moment of forest practices, well, there is still some possibility of doing major clear cuts. The fact of the matter is that we are in a whole different era than when most of those major clear cuts took place. The annual cut now on public lands is down to a very small fraction of what it was just 15 years ago, and it's not going to go up again in any significant way. So in some ways, I'm afraid that what happens with something like end commercial logging is that it becomes a matter of battling the abuses of the past rather than figuring out where we are now and asking, okay, given the fact that there's no likelihood that we're going to cut at the rate that we once did, is it possible now to cut at a genuinely sustainable rate? Go ahead. Do you want to respond to that? Oh, I thought. Okay. Okay. So I think that there's a way in which battling or fighting the battles of the past is counterproductive. I think we can now say, no, we're not going back to those abusive practices of the past, but let's talk seriously now about what sustainable practices would look like. And I think we're in a good position to do that. Then with regard to partisanship, here's my take on it. And I welcome people arguing with me about it. But I've known a lot of legislators, I've served with them, and my sense of it is that the recourse to partisanship is something that is, in a way, bigger than any individual legislator. In other words, it would be natural for us to think if we could just elect different legislators who weren't so subject to partisanship, then things would work differently in Helena. I'm dubious about whether that's the case or not. I think that there is a dynamic at work in Helena in which partisanship and ideology in the service of particular interests just are the driving forces, and that there is practically nothing that individual legislators can do to resist that. Now, I know that people will probably have different opinions about that. I do genuinely welcome a response, but here again, I want to make the comparison between the dynamics at work at the state level and the dynamics at work at a community level. Now, at a community level, we also have party, although we often have nonpartisan elections, but even so, party is in the background. We have ideology, we have interests, and those things show up. You can see them at city council meetings and so on. I think, though, that to the extent that communities work better than the state does, it's because there's another dynamic at work at the community level, and that is active, broad-based citizenship. That in every community, there are dozens and hundreds of people who care for their community and who have put so much into various activities that care for their community that citizenship becomes part of the mix in a way that it just doesn't at the state level. So when you ask the crucial question of how can we ever get legislators to break out of that partisanship, I think part of the answer is that we need a broad-based, clearly focused set of citizens across the state giving legislators support for acting in a different way. Now, and that's sort of part of what our center and others are trying to figure out. Is there a way you could do that? So in a sense, what I'm saying is, I think there is probably value in making it clear to legislators that we don't want them to behave this way. But that kind of negative reinforcement, and I think it does have value, I think it only goes so far, and that there has to be some really strong, politically effective, positive reinforcement for behaving in a different way.
Dan, as part of the scenario that you just expressed, is part of the solution to do away with I forgot what you call them. I beg your pardon? Term limits? No, I was thinking more in terms of paid lobbyists. Doing away with paid lobbyists, or your answer is to get more people, more citizens involved to counter that. But the problem is people can only spend so much time away from their jobs, etc., and don't have the money that paid lobbyists do. So is doing away with lobbyists part of the answer?
Well, it might be. I'm not sure how you would actually make it work. And I'm not familiar with any state that has managed to do that. I think that here's a way of thinking about it, is that even the very best legislators are generally elected mainly because a certain group of interest groups supports them. Another group of interest groups support the other side. But legislators are naturally beholden to those interest groups. And I don't even mean beholden in any kind of corrupt way or anything else. It's just that it's the interest groups that recruit them. It's the interest groups that form the core of their campaign. And what I'm getting at here is that lobbyists, in effect, are just sort of the tip of the iceberg of a political system that's built around particular interests from top to bottom. So unless you do something about the dominance of particular interests, then I think that addressing lobbyists is kind of a matter of addressing a symptom rather than a cause. Now the question any sane person would ask is, yeah, but how are you going to get rid of interest? Well, I don't think you are going to. I think the best that you can do is to try to, in effect, add to the set of interests community interest, a broader sense of community interest. It's just kind of astonishing to me that our legislators, many of whom are good friends of mine, are in some sense not really very connected with community life. They're connected with the various interests that they're most interested in. But there's not a very strong sense in which our communities themselves are represented in Helena. And I guess that's what I'm suggesting that we work on, is trying to bring the strength of our communities to bear in Helena. Claudia?
This actually comes back to something that you were talking about before, about how we could do things differently, or what is it about our state that makes the problems worse. And one of those is the very wide gap between western Montana and eastern Montana. And you know, when you talk about low population areas and how they don't get the services like for children, and also bioregionalism. In the West, we are such a different bioregion than eastern Montana. Schweitzer made the comment that people in eastern Montana don't even know who their legislators are because they listen to North Dakota or South Dakota news. And this is an awfully big question, but how could we divide into more compatible bioregions that can then solve their problems, their common problems? You know, because eastern Montana has such, such a big problem with lack of resources and poverty.
Well, I think that part of the solution there is to move in the direction of giving communities and regions more power, more tools to deal with the issues that they face. So that in western Montana, for example, many of our communities, one of the biggest problems that we face, one of the biggest challenges is growth and in-migration and how to manage growth. We, in Montana, simply don't have the tools at the community level to enable us to do that. And partly that's because Montana has, as a state, has been very unwilling to give individual communities a broad range of tools to deal with their particular situations. So my sense of it is that there's relatively little that the state can do sort of in positive terms to improve economies in any of Montana's regions. But I think, for example, that the region that Great Falls serves as the hub for, if it were given a greater range of tools, if it were given more self-determination about how to deal with its particular problems, whereas the region that Bozeman serves as the hub for, or that Missoula or Billings do, were given the tools that are appropriate to that place, that we would do better than trying to come up with systems and programs that work across the state. I think, in effect, that's what Powell was saying. He was saying different places are different, and inhabiting those places is a unique challenge to that particular place. You need to have sort of the governing capacity to do that. Now, we're not going to take Montana apart and create a whole bunch of different states. That's not going to happen. But it could happen that the state would become more friendly to its communities and regions. It could come to recognize that the only possible way of addressing poverty in Montana, for example, is to make our communities thrive. That's how we will address poverty. That it's within our communities that almost all of these things will happen. I just talked yesterday to the city manager of Great Falls about this, and he said that his experience is that the state of Montana is generally hostile to its communities. Now, that's a very bad place to be, but I think it's generally true. And how we can possibly hope to have thriving economies in Montana when the engines of those economies, namely our communities, are not given the tools to do well, is a real conundrum.